Well, let's take as long as we need to give you a comprehensive update on the coronavirus outbreak. The global death toll is well past 3,000. There are now close to 100,000 confirmed cases in 80 countries. 80,000 of these cases are in China. We should also say more than 50,000 people have been infected but have now fully recovered. Every day, the World Health Organization gives us a briefing. Here's what we heard today.
This epidemic is a threat for every country, rich and poor. And as we have said before, even the high-income countries should expect surprises. The solution is aggressive preparedness. We are concerned that some countries have either not taken this seriously enough or have decided there is nothing they can do.
Well, let's start moving around the world. First to South Africa, which has reported its first case. This is its health minister.
Arrangements are made for the patient to be taken to the center where they will be treated. We have identified or designated hospitals for this, so that treatment is going to take place in that particular area. We are therefore going to be dealing with the members of the family and taking them to the necessary quarantine.
Well, an important element of South Africa's situation is that it has the world's largest HIV epidemic, and there are concerns that millions of people who are HIV positive may be more vulnerable to the coronavirus. Here's Andrew Harding in Johannesburg.
Here in South Africa, you have more than 7 million people living with HIV. That's about 20% of adults under 50. And of course, that virus is known to weaken people's immune system. So, of course, people with TB, people with respiratory problems are likely to be more vulnerable if this virus isn't successfully contained, this new coronavirus.
Well, we move from South Africa to Iran next, because we know there are now over 3,500 cases there. Over 100 people have died. The government's now launched what it's calling a national mobilization plan that includes closing schools and universities. You can also see how public places, this is the capital Tehran, are being disinfected. We also have these unverified pictures, which we believe are from a hospital in the holy city of Qom. There appear to be bodies lying in bags, waiting to be taken away to be buried. Let's hear more on this from Baran Abbasi from BBC Persian.
Officials are saying that we don't know yet whether they have died from corona, and they're keeping the bodies upon the request of the families so they can make sure what the cause of the death is and then give the permission for the burial. But the person who's filmed the footage has been arrested, and in the latest development, the person in charge of the cemetery where the morgue was located has also been removed from his post.
From Iran into Europe next, there have been a number of developments. Switzerland has reported its first death. Bosnia has reported its first case. We also know the Paris Marathon has now been postponed until October. By far the biggest outbreak in Europe, though, is in Italy. Today, all schools and universities closed for at least 10 days. Here's Bethany Bell in Milan.
People across the country who have children are now having to think about childcare. The government has promised to look into measures to help people deal with those issues. It's not quite clear whether they'll give them financial aid and help in looking for babysitters, or whether it'll come in allowing people to one parent to stay at home and work. It should be said that schools and universities in the north of the country have already been closed for almost 2 weeks now. But yesterday, in light of the rising number of infections, the government took this decision to close schools and universities across the country until mid-March.
Well, next we move across the Atlantic to the US. Over the last few days, our primary focus has been an outbreak close to Seattle. Now, though, we have a state of emergency that's been declared in California. One person has died there. They had been on board this cruise ship called the Grand Princess. The passenger had disembarked in San Francisco. As you can see, the ship is now being held at port because several passengers have been taken ill. This is California's governor.
We have accordingly, with this new ICU patient that passed away, entered into this next phase that has required me, under the circumstances, to advance a proclamation of a state of emergency in the state of California.
Well, CBS correspondent Jamie Ucas has more on this from San Francisco.
What we're told is there are about 10 passengers and 11 crew members that are showing symptoms of the coronavirus. That's why there's so much concern. The governor of the state of California said that they would be dropping tests off at that ship and making sure everyone takes them before they allow that ship to come into port here in San Francisco. What happens next is anybody's guess. Amazon is asking its employees in Seattle to work from home for the rest of the month after a worker tested positive there for the virus. And here in California, the governor said the state would reach out to every county with passengers on that cruise ship to keep local officials updated.
We also have this from Reuters just coming into the BBC newsroom telling us Harris County in Texas has announced its first 2 confirmed cases of coronavirus. And they say they are travel related, meaning that these are people who would have travelled outside of the US and have recently returned. Well, let's move from the US to the Middle East now, because the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has declared a 30-day state of emergency. That's after coronavirus cases were reported in Bethlehem in the West Bank. We know that churches are going to be closed, mosques too in Bethlehem, including the Church of the Nativity. Anna Foster is there.
This is Manger Square here in Bethlehem, and there are some days where you can't even see the ground here because it's so packed with tourists. It is never as quiet as this, and part of the reason for all of those visitors is this place here. This is the Church of the Nativity, where Christians believe that Jesus was born. Thousands of people pass through here every day. The crowds, they snake along here, they snake out into the square, but this place is being closed down. In fact, the whole of Bethlehem, in many ways, is being closed down after reportedly 4 cases of COVID-19 among hotel workers at one of the hotels here in Bethlehem.
Well, let's remind you of what we know about the coronavirus. It does share some similarities with the seasonal flu. People can be infected for about 2 weeks before symptoms appear, and then it passes from person to person through the air, often through coughs and sneezes. Among the symptoms are fever, tiredness, dry cough, shortness of breath and muscle pain. This is one woman from Singapore who's had the virus but since recovered.
It felt my lungs were going in overdrive. They were really making an effort. You know, it's not like normal days, right? When we're not even conscious of how we breathe.
One thing we don't yet understand is why some people can be infected and show no symptoms. During the SARS epidemic in the 2000s, scientists could easily identify someone who is infectious because they had symptoms. Not this time. Here are Karen and Jason Honey. They're originally from Melbourne, but they were on the Diamond Princess, that cruise ship that was quarantined in Japan. They both tested positive, but while Karen suffered a severe fever and coughing, Jason felt fine. He's been speaking to ABC Australia.
I've had no fevers, no coughs, no nasal problems, no aches, no pains, nothing. I've not had a single symptom of any sort.
So some people will have symptoms, others will not. I should add both Karen and Jason remain in hospital in Japan. Well, Karen's symptoms eventually disappeared, but then recently she tested positive again, which raised more questions about the nature of this virus. Now, of course, these are just 2 cases. Medical experts say about 80% of people with this virus will recover without needing any special treatment. For more on how to protect yourself, how to avoid getting it in the first place, here's the BBC's global health correspondent, Chiu.
There's the one thing every single person can do, and that's obviously washing their hands regularly, as we've seen, for 20 seconds, several times a day. But it's also important to remember that the World Health Organization is saying, look, this thing can still be contained. We saw what happened with China. There were so many cases. It was looking very frightening there, and actually cases are in decline now. We are seeing these hotspots popping up in other parts of the world now, which is a major concern. Of course it is. But there is still hope there from some of the world's leading scientists that this thing can still be contained.
So 95,000 people infected, over 3,000 people have died. Needless to say, a vaccine for this coronavirus is being sought urgently. Here's the WHO.
More than 20 vaccines are in development globally, and several therapeutics are in clinical trials.
Well, to get to that point that a vaccine can be mass-produced, past experience suggests we'll need to wait around 5 to 15 years. But in this case, scientists are trying to produce one in 18 months. To do so would be unprecedented, as this scientist explains.
We received the sequence from the Chinese government, and we worked overnight, and the next day we had designed a vaccine. We immediately put that vaccine into manufacture, which is the stage that it's currently in, and we hope that that will be entering into human clinical trials by early summer.
Well, this is the Financial Times looking at this issue. It suggests to develop a vaccine at this kind of speed will need government backing and perhaps an investment of around $2 billion. We know some labs are working hard on it. One close to Boston, which is called Moderna, is making good progress. It took just over 40 days to identify the coronavirus in its lab and then create a vaccine against it. That's record speed. And the first human trials of this particular vaccine will begin next month. But before we get ahead of ourselves, listen to this US health official.
The phase 1 trial is 45 individuals. Phase 2 trials are hundreds, if not a couple of thousand individuals. It would take then about a year to a year and a half to be fully confident that we would have a vaccine that would be able to protect the American people. And so although the good news is we did it fast, the bad news is that the reality of vaccinology means this is not going to be something we're going to have tomorrow.
Another US lab is making progress. It's called Inovio. It's in San Diego. It's already made a vaccine for another coronavirus, the MERS virus, which caused an outbreak in the 2010s. Now, this lab is trying to use the same technology to create a new one. Chiu explains.
Swirling around in these fermenters is a very musty smelling solution of bacteria from which the main ingredient for this vaccine, a string of DNA, which it's hoped will trigger a strong immune response against this virus, will be extracted. Traditionally, this process can take months, but here, using these new technologies, it's been taking scientists days.
Now, while work on these vaccines continues, scientists may be looking at a moving target. Researchers at Peking University in China have found that the coronavirus has mutated. Here's some of the research that's been published, and it identifies two main strains of the virus, and that means any vaccine that's developed could work for one strain but not necessarily the other. Here's the BBC's Lauren Moss.
The tests show that there are differences in the genetic codes, but it doesn't prove that it necessarily alters the way that the virus behaves or that one strain is more aggressive than the other. Now, there have been a few media reports about this in the last 24 hours, but at the minute, it does appear the more aggressive type accounted for roughly 70% of the strains which were analysed, which were also in the early stages of the outbreak in China. And the 30% were linked to the less aggressive type. But it does appear as well that the newer strain has become more common.
Now, once the vaccine passes clinical trials, it will then face another significant hurdle, regulatory approval, because governments have to review all the clinical data and then, if they're happy, approve the vaccine. Normally that process would take months, and there are specific issues that could even slow this process down. Here's one leading US expert on vaccinology.
There's this paradoxical, what we call immune enhancement, where the vaccine can actually make things worse. This was a phenomenon that was discovered with a respiratory virus vaccine in the 60s. And we saw it in laboratory animals with experimental vaccines after the original SARS came out in 2003. That's a long way of saying this is not going to go fast, that safety testing can't be compromised.
So there are an awful lot of scientific considerations, but there are political considerations too. Last month in Washington, 40 Democratic members of Congress sent this letter to President Trump. And in the letter, they call for any vaccine or treatment developed with US taxpayer dollars to be accessible, available and affordable. But of course, to make sure that happens is very expensive. Xiaowen Feng in Washington has more.
This coronavirus outbreak is definitely exposing some holes in the U.S. healthcare system. For example, we just mentioned the vaccines, and also the testing fee has been a concern for a lot of people. While the testing itself is supposed to be free, but according to many media reports, uninsured Americans will have to pay more than $1,000 to get tested for coronavirus, and that's a really high fee for ordinary Americans. In China, the government promised to treat all the patients of coronavirus for free, but that's obviously very difficult in the US. The Congress just passed a more than $8 billion bill to support combating coronavirus, and 3 American states, including Washington, Florida, and California, have declared a state of emergency in order to speed up allocating all kinds of resources to combat this virus outbreak. But still, there's no guarantee that people can afford virus testing and vaccines at the moment.
Now, ever since this new coronavirus was identified in December, we've been dealing with what's been called a new viral threat. Not the virus itself, but misinformation, by which I mean reports and advice that are incorrect, misleading, or completely false. Let's look at this in a little more depth. For example, one theory that won't go away is that this virus came from a Chinese lab. Here's the Washington Times in January reporting that COVID-19 could be connected to a Chinese biowarfare program. Or there's this in February, an opinion piece in the New York Post under the headline, "Don't buy China's story, the coronavirus may have leaked from a lab." But there's no evidence to back this up. However, as with a lot of misinformation, there are some grains of truth in there. The outbreak originated in Wuhan in China, and in that city you'll find the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is a high security biolab. But, and this is a very big but, here's the medical journal The Lancet documenting how scientists have analysed the virus, and they've all concluded it came from wildlife and wasn't engineered in a lab. And with wildlife, the suspected source, there's been an awful lot of attention on one live animal and seafood market, also in the centre of Wuhan. One theory is that the virus originated in bats being sold there. And it's true, that is one possible explanation. This, though, will not help you understand that. It's a video of a woman eating bat soup, which went viral a couple of months ago, with lots of people blaming this kind of dish on the virus, except, as the South China Morning Post noted in this article, the video is 3 years old and it's not from Wuhan. This article from the Centre for Disease Control is also helpful. It helps to tell us how the disease could spread from animals to humans, could happen via direct or indirect contact, could happen via pests, water or food. So soup may have been involved, but not the one in the video, and quite possibly not at all. Then there's the issue of advice. Bad advice. For example, here's a Facebook group telling us that a bowl of boiled garlic can cure the virus. It can't. You'll also be aware that lots and lots of people are buying surgical face masks, but doctors are saying these aren't going to help you avoid contracting the virus. And these are just some of hundreds of examples I could show you. But there is, of course, good advice out there. The Centre for Disease Control's website is definitely worth looking at. The WHO has a Mythbuster page on its website, which is excellent. And of course, the BBC News website has an awful lot of verified information about what's happening and what to do, because as the World Health Organization's Director General says, we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. Well, if you do want lots of information, not just on the nature of the coronavirus, but how it's evolving around the world and the different responses of the different governments, you can get all of that through the BBC website, bbc.com/news, or via the BBC News app.